Dawn breaks cold over the ridgeline. The first sound is not birdsong, but Interstate 5, a constant diesel roar 2 miles west. At the locked gate, chain link and steel rise 8 feet high, warning signs bolted to the crossbar. Behind the fence, oak savanna rolls toward mountains still holding February snow. Overhead, a raptor hangs motionless. 270,000 acres, California's largest private landholding, and you cannot walk in. This is Tejon Ranch. But beneath this grandeur lay another story. A story of conservation promised in perpetuity. A story of 19,000 homes granted development certainty. A story where protection and transformation became two outcomes in the same contract. Is this a landmark conservation victory or a blueprint for development disguised as environmental compromise? Chapter 1. The Fence Line. The gate remains locked year-round. Access comes through scheduled programs managed by the Tejon Ranch Conservancy, the nonprofit created to oversee protected lands. Guided hikes on designated trails. Naturalist-led tours during specific seasons. Membership programs offering entry on prescribed dates. You pay for brief visits to what the corporation owns permanently. The ranch operates an Explorer membership program. Annual fees grant access to guided experiences. The land opens, but only on the company's terms and timeline. The numbers establish scale that defies casual comprehension. 270,000 acres stretch across 4 counties, encompassing watersheds and mountain ranges. The ranch represents the largest contiguous private landholding in California. No other single owner controls this much land in one unbroken piece. The property extends from the San Joaquin Valley floor through the Tehachapi Mountains to the edge of the Mojave Desert. You could fit several major cities inside its boundaries. The fence line runs for hundreds of miles. In 2008, Tejon Ranch Company signed what was described as one of the largest private conservation agreements in American history. The agreement committed approximately 240,000 acres to long-term conservation, 90% of the ranch protected in perpetuity, the language promised. 5 major environmental organizations signed as partners: Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, Audubon, California, Planning and Conservation League, Endangered Habitats League. The signatory groups agreed not to challenge developments in designated zones. The Tejon Ranch Conservancy was established to manage protected lands and coordinate public access. Supporters called it a landmark compromise. But the same agreement granted development certainty in 3 specific areas: Centennial, envisioned to hold 19,000 residential units; Mountain Village, with thousands more homes planned; Grapevine, positioned near existing commercial operations. These were not possibilities subject to future negotiation. They were contractually authorized outcomes written into the conservation bargain itself. Protect the majority, develop the rest. The trade was explicit. Neither outcome could be challenged by signatory organizations. The corporation describes this as balanced land management. Critics describe it as laundering development through conservation agreements. Both perspectives reference the same legal documents. The protections exist. The authorizations exist. The question is not whether the paradox is real. The question is what it means when conservation becomes the price paid for development rights, negotiated by organizations that promised not to litigate. Roughly 178,000 acres were protected through initial deed restrictions and conservation easements. An additional 62,000 acres would be made available for purchase through future conservation easements. The state eventually funded those additional easements through a Wildlife Conservation Board grant of $15.8 million. The easements sold for $15.75 million. The discrepancy was $50,000. The land became protected. The money changed hands. The mechanism was established. The Conservancy began offering limited public access shortly after. At the gate, trucks rumble past on Interstate 5. Travelers stop at outlet malls and truck stops without knowing what lies beyond the fence. The land appears empty to anyone passing through. But emptiness is not the same as unused. The ranch is occupied by cattle operations, conservation biologists monitoring camera traps, corporate planners mapping future developments, shareholders expecting returns, wildlife moving through corridors that exist only because this land remains intact. What is being protected behind the locks, and what is being prepared for transformation? Chapter 2. 4 Californias. Meet here. The ridgeline divides worlds. Desert on one side, valley on the other. Between them, mountain and foothill ecosystems stacked by elevation. This convergence is documented biogeography, not metaphor. 4 distinct ecological regions collide at Tejon Ranch: the southern Sierra Nevada, the Tehachapi Mountains, the San Joaquin Valley, the western Mojave Desert. Each brings species adapted to different conditions. Each depends on the others for connectivity. At the highest elevations near 8,000 feet, ponderosa pines and mixed conifers hold ground. Lower, oak woodlands dominate. Valley oak, blue oak, coast live oak. Their canopies create shade islands across grasslands that turn emerald after winter rains and gold by summer. Lower still, the landscape transitions to desert scrub: creosote bush, saltbush, Joshua trees scattered across alluvial fans. In canyon bottoms, riparian corridors follow seasonal streams, thick with willows and sycamores, providing habitat structure absent everywhere else. Conservation biologists use the term connectivity to describe what this geography enables. The ranch functions as a wildlife corridor, linking the Sierra Nevada to the transverse ranges. Without this connection, protected lands to the north and south become islands. Species with large territories require room to move: mountain lions, black bears, bobcats. Genetic exchange between populations depends on individuals traveling through suitable habitat. When development fragments landscapes, populations become isolated. Isolation leads to genetic bottlenecks. Bottlenecks increase extinction risk. California condors became the public face of what conservation here might preserve. The species nearly vanished in the 20th century. By the 1980s, fewer than 24 birds remained in the wild. Captive breeding programs rebuilt populations slowly, releasing birds into carefully selected territories. Tejon Ranch lies within the flight range of the southern flock. Condors require vast territories and thermal updrafts generated by mountains. They scavenge carcasses across dozens of miles in single foraging flights. The ranch provides the space and the topography. Biologists document sightings through camera traps and radio telemetry. The birds circle above ridgelines, wings spanning nearly 10 feet. Other species matter just as much but attract less attention. The San Joaquin kit fox, listed as endangered, occupies valley grasslands. Blunt-nosed leopard lizard depends on specific soil and vegetation conditions. Tipton kangaroo rat requires loose, sandy soils in valley habitat, increasingly converted to agriculture. The ranch hosts populations of each. These species do not command the emotional response of condors. They are small, cryptic, difficult to observe. But their presence indicates intact ecosystems functioning at multiple scales. Valley oaks anchor visual identity across the landscape. Some are more than 3 centuries old. These trees grow slowly, spreading wide rather than tall. Their limbs twist and branch at unpredictable angles. In winter, they stand bare, skeletal against grass. In spring, New leaves emerge pale green. By summer, the canopy provides dense shade that cattle seek during the hottest hours. The oaks at Fort Tejon State Historic Park draw visitors who photograph gnarled trunks and spreading branches. The trees are icons. They also provide critical habitat: nesting cavities for owls and woodpeckers, acorns for deer and ground squirrels, shade that maintains understory diversity. Riparian corridors add another layer. Seasonal streams cut through upland areas, creating ribbons of moisture-dependent vegetation. Willows and cottonwoods line the channels. These corridors provide drinking water, cover, movement routes. They also concentrate biodiversity. Surveys document higher species richness in riparian zones than surrounding grasslands or scrub. The corridors connect upland and lowland habitats, allowing species to move between elevations as conditions change seasonally. The numbers document scale that conservation scientists describe as irreplaceable. 270,000 acres under single ownership creates the largest intact private landscape in the state. The 2008 Conservation Agreement committed approximately 240,000 of those acres to permanent protection. The protected area includes roughly 178,000 acres, preserved through deed restrictions and conservation easements already in place. An additional 62,000 acres were made available for purchase through future conservation easements. The state funded those additional easements through a Wildlife Conservation Board grant of $15.8 million. The easements sold for $15.75 million. The land became protected. The mechanism was established. To scientists who study landscape ecology, Tejon Ranch represents something increasingly rare: a large, intact, privately owned landscape that could be permanently protected through agreements rather than government acquisition. To developers, it represents one of the last substantial land holdings near major metropolitan areas where large-scale projects remain possible. To the corporation managing it, the ranch is both: a conservation asset and a development portfolio. To the environmental organizations that signed the 2008 agreement, it was a pragmatic compromise securing conservation at scale by accepting development in defined zones. The geographic position creates obligations beyond biology. Tejon Ranch sits directly on the San Andreas Fault. The 1,857 Fort Tejon earthquake, registered between magnitude 7.9 and 8.0, rupturing approximately 350 kilometers of the fault line. The earthquake remains one of the largest in California's recorded history. Only 2 deaths were attributed to the event, but the region was sparsely populated then. Today, major infrastructure crosses the same fault zone. Interstate 5 climbs the Grapevine Grade just miles from the ranch boundary. The California Aqueduct carries water to Southern California through the fault zone. Power transmission lines span the ridgelines. The next major earthquake will test every structure built in this corridor. The ridgeline at sunset glows amber, then fades to blue-gray as darkness rises from the valleys. Condors return to roosting sites on cliffs. Cattle settle into bedding areas. Biologists check camera traps for images captured overnight. The land functions as it has for millennia. Species moving through seasons, adapting to conditions, following rhythms of water and temperature and food availability. If this place is so valuable as a biological corridor, why does its future remain contested in courtrooms and boardrooms? Chapter 3. Before the Maps. Before property lines were drawn and fences erected, the land belonged to patterns older than any document could record. Multiple native nations occupied the region where the Tehachapi Mountains meet the valley and desert. The tribes most frequently cited in modern timelines include the Kitanamuk, Yokuts, Chumash, Tataviam, and Kawaiisu. These names appear in archaeological surveys and public-facing histories. They represent a beginning, not a complete accounting. Tribal historians and descendants hold knowledge that survives outside written records. The landscape supported seasonal movement across elevation zones. Oak groves in foothill canyons provided acorns harvested in autumn and stored through winter. Riparian corridors offered water, willows for basketry, game that concentrated near streams. Higher elevations yielded pine nuts and provided summer hunting grounds. Desert margins produced different resources at different times. The pattern was not random wandering, but deliberate. Resource management developed over centuries. Each season brought movement to places that provided what was needed when it was needed. The name Tejon appears across this history in ways that create confusion requiring constant clarification. The Spanish term means badger. Mexican-era land grants incorporated the name. Fort Tejon took the name in the 1850s. Tejon Ranch Company uses the name now. The Tejon Indian Tribe is a federally recognized tribal government. These entities are distinct. The name connects them to place, but does not make them equivalent. Keeping these distinctions clear requires deliberate precision throughout any discussion of this landscape. The cultural landscape contained sites whose locations and significance are not public information. Some are burial grounds, some mark ceremonial locations, some contain material culture that remains sacred. These sites exist. They are known to tribal communities and to archaeologists who work under consultation protocols. Film crews and researchers encounter constraints shaped by these realities. What cannot be filmed, what cannot be disclosed, what requires permission and consultation, these are not arbitrary restrictions. They reflect ongoing relationships between living communities and ancestral lands. Contemporary tribal communities maintain connections to this region despite displacement and disruption spanning more than a century. The Tejon Indian Tribe operates a casino that opened in late 2025 near the Interstate 5 corridor. Recognition came through federal processes documented in government materials. The casino represents sovereignty exercised through economic development on trust land. It is not the corporation, it is not the ranch. It is a separate governmental entity with its own history and contemporary presence. Mexican-era grants created the first documented property claims Europeans would recognize. Grants issued between 1843 and 1846 covered areas that would later consolidate into what became Tejon Ranch. The grants represented Spain's and then Mexico's assertion of sovereignty over lands indigenous peoples had never ceded through any process those governments would have recognized as legitimate. The grants created paper claims to territory measured in leagues and described by natural features. Boundaries were imprecise. Ownership transferred through processes that treated land as commodity rather than homeland. What was lost in this transition cannot be quantified through acreage alone. Seasonal movement became trespassing. Resource management practices developed over generations became illegal harvesting. Sacred sites became property whose access required permission from owners who often knew nothing of what they controlled. Knowledge systems built on direct relationship with specific places eroded when people were separated from those places. Languages tied to particular landscapes lost speakers when communities were scattered. The transformation was neither sudden nor complete, but it was irreversible in ways that compounded over time. Each generation faced conditions their grandparents would not have recognized. The land itself remained. The oaks still produced acorns. The streams still flowed seasonally. The mountains still held snow, but the relationship between people and place had been severed legally, economically, and often physically. The fences and property markers came later. The conceptual framework that made fences thinkable came first. By the time the United States claimed California, indigenous peoples faced not just displacement from specific places, but erasure from the documented history of those places. Surveys and maps showed empty land awaiting productive use. Legal frameworks treated existing inhabitants as obstacles to improvement rather than as people with prior claims. Protection, when it came, arrived in forms designed to control rather than preserve autonomy. Federal power would enter this landscape carrying promises of protection that served purposes very different from what that word suggested. Within years, a reservation would be established, and a fort built to enforce it. The Sebastian Indian Reservation was established in 1853. Federal officials described it as the first reservation in California. The designation carried implications that extended far beyond this specific location. Reservations represented a policy framework for managing indigenous peoples the United States claimed authority over but did not wish to exterminate outright. The framework presumed federal control over land and over the people placed there. Protection became inseparable from confinement. Fort Tejon followed in 1854. The United States Army built the installation explicitly to support the reservation system. State Parks documentation describes the fort's mission as protecting both native people and settlers. The phrasing suggests equivalence. The reality involved different meanings of protection applied to different groups. For native peoples removed to the reservation, protection meant enforced residence in designated areas under federal oversight. For settlers, protection meant military presence ensuring native peoples stayed where they had been placed and posed no threat to expanding settlement. The fort occupied a strategic position along the route between the San Joaquin Valley and the Los Angeles Basin. Supply lines required protection. Travel routes required military presence. The reservation provided a mechanism for consolidating scattered native populations into a controllable location. The fort provided the force necessary to maintain that consolidation. Neither institution existed to serve the interests of the people they were ostensibly protecting. Construction followed standard Army specifications for frontier installations. Barracks housed troops. Officers' quarters reflected rank distinctions. A parade ground provided space for drilling and formations. Storehouses held supplies. The structures were built from local materials: adobe for walls, wood for framing and roofing. The buildings were functional rather than impressive. Permanence was not the goal. The fort existed to project power during a transitional period. That transition involved transforming indigenous presence from autonomous occupation to managed populations under federal authority. The reservation system presumed native peoples would eventually disappear through assimilation or attrition. In the interim, they would be contained in locations that did not interfere with settlement and economic development. The fort enforced this arrangement. Soldiers pursued people who left the reservation without permission. They prevented unauthorized entry. They maintained the boundaries that made the system function. The Valley Oak Grove at Fort Tejon became one of the installation's enduring visual features. The trees predated the fort by centuries. Their presence provided shade during the intense summer heat. Soldiers camped beneath their branches. Officers held formations in the dappled light. The oaks existed independent of human conflict, but their location placed them within a landscape being fundamentally reorganized around principles of control and extraction. The fort closed in 1864. A decade had passed. The immediate pressures that justified military presence had shifted. The Civil War redirected resources and attention. The reservation system had achieved its primary goal of removing native peoples from lands targeted for settlement. Troops withdrew. The buildings fell into disrepair. Some were dismantled for materials, others collapsed from neglect. The site became a marker of something that had happened rather than an active instrument of policy. But the patterns established during those 10 years persisted. Land once held communally or seasonally became property divided among owners who had no connection to the place beyond legal title. Native peoples who had been removed to the reservation faced limited options when it dissolved. Some remained in the area under conditions offering few resources and no legal standing. Others scattered. The structures of displacement remained even after the specific institution closed. Today, Fort Tejon State Historic Park preserves what remains: the adobe ruins, the valley oak grove. Interpretive signs explain the fort's history. Visitors photograph the trees and walk among the remnants. State Parks materials describe the fort as protecting people during a turbulent period. The language is carefully neutral. It treats protection as unambiguous. It does not dwell on what protection meant in practice or who benefited from the arrangement. The irony is precise. A preservation site dedicated to maintaining historical memory sits on land shaped by policies designed to erase indigenous presence from that same landscape. The oaks endure, the ruins remain. The displacement they witnessed is documented but not centered. History becomes heritage. Conflict becomes context. The land itself testifies to what documents often obscure. The fort closed, but the consolidation model it enabled continued. Property that had been divided into Mexican-era grants and then subdivided through American ownership would eventually concentrate under a single corporate entity. The mechanisms would be legal and economic rather than military. The outcome would be the same: control over the entire landscape by a single owner operating under frameworks established when displacement was explicit policy. Within years of the fort's closure, the ground would shake in ways that made human conflicts seem temporary. Chapter 5. The Earthquake That Never Ended. January 9, 1857. Dawn broke cold and clear. At Fort Tejon, soldiers prepared for routine morning formations. Then the ground began to move. Not the brief, sharp jolt of a minor tremor, a sustained, violent shaking that continued for 1 to 3 minutes, depending on which account you credit. Buildings collapsed. The ground split open along a line running northwest to southeast. Trees snapped. Landslides blocked canyon passages. The earthquake that would carry Fort Tejon's name into seismological history had announced that this landscape existed on borrowed stability. The earthquake registered between magnitude 7.9 and 8.0. Scientists studying the event centuries later calculated the rupture extended approximately 350 kilometers along the San Andreas Fault. The fault trace became visible in ways it had not been before. The ground on opposite sides of the break shifted horizontally by several meters. Streams that had flowed straight now bent at sharp angles where the fault crossed them. The physical evidence remained legible in the landscape for anyone who knew how to read geological violence. 2 deaths were attributed to the earthquake. One woman died at Fort Tejon when an adobe building collapsed. Another person died near the mission at San Fernando. These numbers appear frequently in historical accounts. They suggest the earthquake was powerful, but not catastrophic in human terms. The context matters. The region was sparsely populated. No major cities existed near the epicenter. The infrastructure that could fail spectacularly did not yet exist. The low death toll reflected absence of exposure, not absence of danger. The San Andreas Fault runs directly beneath Tejon Ranch. The fault is not dormant, it is locked. Tectonic plates on either side continue moving. Stress accumulates along the fault line. Eventually, that stress will release. The question is not whether another major earthquake will occur. The question is when. Seismologists speak in probabilities calculated over decades. 30% chance in the next 30 years, 70% in the next 50. The percentages vary depending on models and assumptions. The certainty does not. Modern infrastructure crosses the fault zone in ways that would have been unimaginable in 1857. Interstate 5 climbs the Grapevine Grade through Tejon Pass, carrying hundreds of thousands of vehicles daily. The California Aqueduct threads through the mountains, delivering water to Southern California cities. High-voltage transmission lines span the ridgelines, connecting northern and southern portions of the state's electrical grid. Each system is engineered to withstand significant shaking. Each would be tested in ways no engineering can fully predict when the fault ruptures again. The proposed developments sit on land the earthquake demonstrated was geologically unstable. Centennial, planned for nearly 20,000 residential units, occupies areas where the fault trace remains visible. Mountain Village and Grapevine similarly place permanent infrastructure in zones that will experience ground shaking exceeding any building code assumption when the next major event occurs. The developments are not ignorant of this risk. Environmental impact reports acknowledge seismic hazards. Engineering specifications incorporate fault setbacks and enhanced structural requirements. The acknowledgement does not eliminate the risk. It redistributes it onto people who will live in homes built where the ground periodically tears itself apart. The 1857 earthquake serves as both historical event and recurring character in any discussion of this landscape. It provides a magnitude benchmark. It demonstrates what the fault is capable of producing. It marks a moment when the land's instability became undeniable. The earthquake becomes a natural villain that can be invoked whenever questions arise about building in hazardous locations. If the land is this dangerous, why develop it at all? If the danger is acknowledged, what responsibility do developers and regulators bear when the inevitable occurs? The fault does not care about property lines or conservation agreements. It does not distinguish between protected wildlands and approved development zones. When the stress releases, the shaking will affect everything simultaneously. The ridgelines where condors soar, the valleys where endangered species persist, the corridors where Interstate 5 funnels traffic through the narrowest passage, the transmission lines carrying power, the aqueduct carrying water, the homes that do not yet exist but have been authorized. The ground will move, structures will fail. The question is, how many structures and how many people will be exposed to that failure? The earthquake that struck in 1857 ended after minutes of shaking. The geological process that caused it continues. The fault remains locked. The plates keep moving. The stress keeps building. The 1857 event set a benchmark for what this landscape can produce. The next event will test everything humans have built since. If the land is this geologically unstable, demonstrably capable of producing some of the most powerful earthquakes in California's recorded history, how did a single corporation come to own it all? And having gained that ownership, how did they transform geological risk into financial opportunity? Chapter 6: Consolidation and the Corporation. The Mexican land grants issued between 1843 and 1846 created the first property framework Europeans would recognize. Multiple grants covered overlapping territories described by natural features rather than surveyed boundaries. Rivers, ridgelines, prominent oaks. The descriptions were sufficient for establishing claim but imprecise for establishing exact extent. After the United States claimed California, those imprecise grants became contested property subject to American courts and American concepts of ownership. Early consolidation happened through mechanisms both legal and opportunistic. Grants changed hands through purchase, foreclosure, marriage, inheritance. Families who received initial grants lost them to creditors. Speculators acquired parcels and assembled larger holdings. Some transactions were straightforward sales. Others involved legal challenges where better-funded parties could sustain litigation longer than original grant holders. Scattered properties gradually concentrated in fewer hands. By the early 20th century, substantial acreage had consolidated under entities that saw the land as investment rather than homeland. Cattle ranching provided income from property that would otherwise generate nothing, while holding value as future development. The ranching was real. Cattle grazed the grasslands. Cowboys worked the herds. Hay grew in irrigated valleys. But ranching was also placeholder activity. The land's ultimate value lay not in what it produced annually, but in what it might become eventually. Tejon Ranch Company incorporated in 1936. The incorporation brought legal structure to what had been evolving through less formal arrangements. The company became the owner of record for the consolidated properties. Shares could be traded. Governance operated through boards and officers. Decisions about land use moved from individuals to institutional processes. The corporation became immortal in ways humans are not. It could hold property across generations without the disruptions of death and inheritance. The company remained primarily a ranching operation through the mid-20th century. Cattle operations continued as they had for decades. Some agriculture developed where water was available. The land generated modest returns appropriate to agricultural property in a remote location. Interstate 5 changed the equation. The freeway transformed the Grapevine grade from a challenging mountain passage into a major transportation corridor. Traffic volume increased dramatically. The ranch suddenly occupied a strategic position between California's two largest metropolitan regions. Real estate development became plausible in ways it had not been when the property was genuinely remote. The company began exploring how to convert portions of the ranch from agricultural to commercial and residential use. Early efforts focused on small projects near the interstate corridor. A truck stop, some retail. These generated revenue and demonstrated that development was possible. The larger question was how to unlock value from a landscape that was simultaneously enormous, largely undeveloped, and subject to environmental protections that made traditional subdivision difficult. The company went public. Shares traded on stock exchanges. Institutional investors acquired positions. Pension funds, mutual funds, hedge funds. The shareholder base became diverse and distributed. Some shareholders held positions because they believed in the company's stewardship model. Some held positions because they saw undervalued real estate assets. Some held positions because the stock was included in indices they tracked. The diversity of shareholder motivations created governance tensions that would intensify over time. Board composition reflected traditional corporate governance patterns. Directors with business backgrounds, some with real estate experience, some with financial expertise. The board's fiduciary duty was clear: maximize shareholder value within legal constraints. What that meant in practice when the asset was a landscape rather than a factory became the defining question. Did maximizing value require developing as much land as possible as quickly as possible? Or did it require patient stewardship that preserved optionality across decades? By the late 1990s, the company controlled approximately 270,000 acres in a single contiguous block. No other private landowner in California could make that claim. The property included mountains, valleys, desert margins, riparian corridors. It held endangered species habitat. It occupied a critical wildlife corridor. It sat atop active fault lines. It was visible from the state's most important north-south transportation corridor. It was simultaneously an ecological treasure and a development opportunity. Environmental groups had been monitoring the ranch for years. Each development proposal triggered litigation. California Environmental Quality Act challenges delayed projects and increased costs. The company won some cases. Environmental groups won others. The pattern was predictable and unsustainable. Neither side could achieve certainty. The company could not guarantee shareholders that approved projects would survive legal challenge. Environmental groups could not guarantee that litigation would permanently stop development. Something had to change. By 2008, both sides were ready to negotiate a different framework. The company had identified 3 specific areas where development made economic sense and where infrastructure could feasibly reach. Environmental groups had concluded that protecting the vast majority of the ranch permanently was worth accepting development in defined zones. The question was whether they could reach an agreement that would hold up legally and politically. The company controlled the entire landscape. Nearly 300 years after the first land grants were issued, all of that scattered property had consolidated under a single corporate entity. The consolidation had happened through patient accumulation and institutional continuity. No individual human could have sustained the effort. A corporation could. What made them willing to sign away development rights on 90% of the property they had spent decades consolidating? Chapter 7. The Grand Bargain. The agreement was signed on May 8, 2008. Tejon Ranch Company on one side, 5 environmental organizations on the other, Natural Resources Defense Council, Sierra Club, Audubon, California, Planning and Conservation League, Endangered Habitats League. These were not fringe groups. They were established organizations with legal departments, fundraising capacity, political connections. Their participation gave the agreement legitimacy that would have been impossible with lesser-known signatories. The conservation commitment was precise. Approximately 240,000 acres would be placed under permanent conservation. The figure represented roughly 90% of the ranch. Some acreage was already protected through previous easements. Additional land would be protected through new conservation easements the company agreed to grant. The protected areas included the most ecologically sensitive portions of the property: ridgelines where condors soared, corridors where mountain lions moved, grasslands where endangered species persisted. The commitment was documented in legal language that bound the company and its successors in perpetuity. In exchange, the company received development certainty in 3 designated zones. Centennial, positioned in northwestern Los Angeles County, could proceed as planned. Mountain Village, in the Tehachapi Mountains, could move forward. Grapevine, near existing commercial operations along Interstate 5, was authorized. The signatory environmental groups agreed not to challenge these projects under the California Environmental Quality Act or through other legal mechanisms. The no-challenge provision was explicit. The company could develop these areas without facing litigation from the organizations that had previously blocked or delayed every significant proposal. The Tejon Ranch Conservancy was created as the operational mechanism. The Conservancy was structured as an independent nonprofit. Its board included representatives from the signatory environmental groups and from the company. The Conservancy would manage the protected lands. It would conduct biological monitoring. It would coordinate scientific research. It would provide limited public access through guided programs. The Conservancy became both the evidence that the agreement was working and the institution responsible for making it work. Funding for the Conservancy came from multiple sources. The company committed to annual payments. The exact amounts varied over time, but were documented in Securities and Exchange Commission filings. One disclosed period showed approximately $800,000 annually. State agencies provided grants for specific conservation work. The Wildlife Conservation Board grant that funded the additional easements totaled $15.8 million. Federal agencies contributed to habitat management programs. The Conservancy operated on a budget smaller than what managing 240,000 acres would require if it were fully public land. The funding was sufficient for core functions, but constrained the scope of what could be accomplished. What each side gained was clear. The company gained development certainty that dramatically increased the value of the 3 designated zones. With litigation risk eliminated, the projects could proceed to entitlement and financing. Shareholders could calculate returns based on probable rather than speculative outcomes. The conservation community gained permanent protection for an enormous landscape that would otherwise face incremental development pressure indefinitely. 90% protected was better than endless litigation over 100%. What each side gave up was equally clear. The company gave up the legal right to develop 90% of its landholding. The optionality that had existed before the agreement disappeared. Future boards could not revisit the decision. Future shareholders could not argue for developing protected areas regardless of market conditions or financial pressure. The environmental groups gave up the ability to challenge development in the 3 designated zones. They could not sue over greenhouse gas emissions, water use, wildfire risk, traffic impacts. They had agreed not to, and that agreement was binding. The signing ceremony included speeches about collaboration and pragmatism. Representatives from each organization described the agreement as a model for balancing conservation and development. The language emphasized partnership and long-term thinking. Photographs showed people shaking hands. The documents were bound in leather folders. The optics suggested mutual satisfaction. But the agreement did not end. Debate about whether the bargain was wise. Critics who were not party to the negotiations argued that environmental groups had legitimized projects that should never be built. Accepting development in high-risk areas in exchange for protecting lands that were already largely undeveloped was trading something real for something inevitable. Supporters responded that without the agreement, all 270,000 acres remained vulnerable to development proposals the company had every legal right to pursue. The distinction between signatory and non-signatory organizations mattered. The agreement bound only those who signed it. Other environmental groups, community organizations, individuals, they retained the right to challenge the projects through CEQA and other legal mechanisms. Litigation continued even after the agreement. Courts would eventually rule on questions the 2008 agreement did not resolve. The grand bargain created certainty between specific parties. It did not create certainty for everyone else. The agreement also assumed stable governance within both the company and the Conservancy. It assumed the partnership model would persist across decades. It assumed funding would continue. It assumed the signatory organizations would maintain their commitment even as leadership changed. It assumed that shareholders would accept limits on development even if financial pressure intensified. The agreement was legally binding. Whether it was institutionally sustainable remained to be tested. By signing the agreement, the company and the environmental groups created a framework that would shape the landscape for generations. The protected lands would remain protected. The development zones would be developed. The Conservancy would monitor and manage. The access programs would continue. Everything was decided, or everything appeared decided. The agreement created certainty for those at the table. But certainty for a corporation and 5 environmental organizations is not certainty for everyone affected by the outcome. People who would live in home not yet built. Workers who would commute distances not yet traveled. Communities that would experience impacts not yet realized. Taxpayers who would fund infrastructure not yet constructed. They were not at the table in 2008. The agreement was made without their input. The consequences would be theirs regardless. Chapter 8. Access as Currency. The Tejon Ranch Explorer membership program launched shortly after the Conservancy began operations. The program offered paying members scheduled access to lands that remained closed to the general public. Membership came in tiers. Annual memberships provided access to guided hikes on designated trails. Higher-tier memberships offered additional opportunities. Naturalist-led tours during wildflower season. Birding excursions focused on specific species. Photography workshops in locations chosen for visual impact. The pricing was substantial but not prohibitive for people with disposable income. Several $100s for annual membership. Additional fees for special programs. The revenue supported Conservancy operations. It also restricted access to people who could afford the fees and who were willing to accept the program's structure. You could not simply drive to the ranch and walk in. You submitted applications. You waited for approval. You received schedules for pre-planned activities. You followed guides along approved routes. You left when the program ended. The model contrasts sharply with access to adjacent public lands. Los Padres National Forest lies immediately west of the ranch. Anyone can enter at any time without paying fees or submitting applications. Trails are marked but not monitored. You hike where you choose. You camp where regulations permit. The Forest Service maintains infrastructure but does not control who uses it or when. The difference is fundamental. Public land belongs to everyone. Private land belongs to someone. Access to private land is a privilege that can be granted, withheld, or modified at any time. Tejon Ranch. Conservancy describes the access programs as evidence that conservation is working. Thousands of people have participated in guided hikes since the program began. Educational materials distributed during tours explain the ecological significance of the landscape. Participants see condors, photograph oaks, learn about connectivity. The Conservancy frames this as public benefit flowing from the 2008 agreement. Without the agreement, no public access would exist. The ranch would remain entirely closed. The framing is accurate but incomplete. The access exists on terms the company and Conservancy define. Routes are chosen to minimize disturbance to sensitive areas and to showcase conservation successes. Timing is controlled to protect wildlife during nesting seasons. Group sizes are limited to reduce impact. These constraints serve legitimate management purposes. They also ensure that access never threatens the company's operational control over the landscape. Locked gates remain the visual reality across most of the ranch boundary. Chain-link fencing, warning signs, no trespassing. The gates appear every few miles along roads that parallel the property. Some gates are industrial steel. Some are simple stock gates secured with padlocks. All communicate the same message. This land is private. Entry without permission is illegal. prosecution is possible. The contrast between marketing and reality is precise. Company communications emphasize conservation leadership and public access programs. They highlight partnerships with environmental organizations. They describe stewardship commitments. The communications are accurate. They are also strategic. They present the ranch as a conservation success story where private ownership enables outcomes public ownership could not achieve. The message is that private stewardship serves public interest better than traditional preservation models. Critics present a different interpretation. They see a corporation that secured development rights by offering limited access as proof of public benefit. The access is real but constrained. The public benefit is measurable but restricted to people who can pay membership fees and who accept guided tours instead of autonomous exploration. The arrangement serves the company's interests by demonstrating conservation credentials while maintaining absolute control over land use decisions. Both perspectives are simultaneously true. The ranch would be entirely closed without the agreement. Limited access is better than no access. The conservation commitment is genuine and legally binding, but access granted is not the same as rights retained. Public benefit provided through corporate discretion is not equivalent to public ownership or public rights. The distinction matters legally and philosophically. National forests and state parks operate under frameworks where public access is presumed unless specifically restricted for resource protection. The starting point is openness. At Tejon Ranch, the starting point is closure. Access exists because the Conservancy and company choose to provide it, not because the public has any inherent right to enter. If funding declined, access programs could be reduced or eliminated. If priorities shifted, routes could change or opportunities could narrow. The public cannot demand anything. They can only accept what is offered or choose not to participate. The Conservancy emphasizes that managing public access requires resources. Guides must be hired and trained. Insurance must be purchased. Trails must be maintained. Environmental monitoring must ensure access does not harm species the agreement intended to protect. These are legitimate operational requirements. They are also mechanisms that ensure access remains controlled and limited. Open access would require different infrastructure and would create exposure to liability. The company has no reason to accept. The arrangement reveals something fundamental about private conservation models. Conservation can be genuine and substantial while still serving private interests. Protecting 240,000 acres is a legitimate achievement, regardless of what motivated the company to agree to it. But protection achieved through negotiated agreements between powerful institutions is different from protection achieved through democratic processes or public acquisition. The outcomes may look similar on a map. The power dynamics are entirely different. At the locked gate, the reality is unchanged from before the 2008 agreement. You cannot enter without permission. The land beyond the fence remains private. The corporation that owns it makes decisions about its use and access. The Conservancy manages the protected portions, but the company retains ultimate control. The environmental organizations agreed not to challenge development in designated zones. The public was never asked whether the bargain was acceptable. Access granted is not the same as rights retained. The company offers guided hikes as proof that conservation serves public interest, but who decides how much access is enough? Who determines which areas remain closed and which open? Who controls whether programs expand or contract? The answers are clear. The company decides. The Conservancy implements. The public accepts what is offered or stays beyond the fence. Chapter 9. Centennial. The project boundary appears on the map as a polygon in northwestern Los Angeles County. 12,323 acres designated for transformation. The edges abut conserved lands on 3 sides. On the 4th side, State Route 138 provides the only evacuation corridor to Interstate 5. The map shows 19,333 residential units planned for construction, 10,100,000 square feet of commercial space. 45% of the project footprint designated as open space within the boundary. 3,500 units classified as affordable housing in company disclosures. The numbers document scale. The map shows location. Neither reveals what happens when courts examine the assumptions underneath. Centennial is the flagship, the largest of the 3 developments authorized by the 2008 agreement. The project that tests whether the conservation bargain actually holds. Environmental groups that signed the agreement promised not to challenge development in designated zones. Other organizations made no such promise. Center for Biological Diversity filed litigation shortly after Los Angeles County approved the project in 2019. The lawsuit challenged the adequacy of the Environmental Impact Report under the California Environmental Quality Act. CEQA requires agencies to identify significant impacts and mitigate them or explain why mitigation is infeasible. The question is, what counts as adequate analysis and what counts as real mitigation? Environmental considerations remain central. The litigation focused on greenhouse gas emissions accounting. The county's environmental review claimed that Centennial's emissions would be offset because the project would comply with California's cap-and-trade program. But cap-and-trade applies to specific covered entities, power plants, refineries, large industrial operations. A residential and commercial development is not a covered entity. The housing and businesses would generate emissions. Those emissions would contribute to climate change. The cap-and-trade program requires other entities to reduce their emissions according to regulations that already bind them. Claiming credit for someone else's legally mandated compliance is not additional mitigation. It is accounting creativity. Greenhouse concerns drive the debate. The appellate court ruled in 2025 that this approach failed CEQA's requirements. The county could not claim that cap-and-trade compliance by covered entities somehow offset Centennial's emissions. The mitigation was not additional. It was not project-specific. It was not real in the way CEQA demands mitigation be real. The ruling did not stop the project. It required the county to revise the environmental review and address the climate analysis with methods that survived scrutiny. The company disclosed in Securities and Exchange Commission filings that re-entitlement proceedings could return to county hearings with anticipated board action by the end of 2026. Appellate decisions shape the path forward. Wildfire analysis became another contested issue. The project sits in an area where wildfire hazard is high. Hazard reflects expected fire behavior based on fuel loads, topography, weather patterns, and historical burn probability calculated over 30 to 50 years. Risk adds human exposure. People, homes, evacuation routes, insurance availability. Hazard mapping shows where fire is likely to occur and how it will behave. Risk assessment shows who gets hurt when it does. Wildfire. Risk remains a critical factor. State Route 138 is a 2-lane road through most of the segment serving the project area. During evacuation, that road becomes the primary egress route for 19,000 homes. The environmental review included evacuation modeling. Critics argued the modeling understated congestion and overstated capacity. Wind patterns in the area can drive fire behavior that makes orderly evacuation difficult. The Grapevine grade experiences Santa Ana wind events that accelerate fire spread. Evacuation planning is essential. When fire moves faster than traffic, evacuation models become mortality predictions. The 2025 appellate opinion addressed wildfire analysis as part of a broader critique of how risks were presented and mitigated. The court did not declare the project unbuildable. It said the environmental review needed more rigorous analysis of specific hazards and more concrete mitigation measures. The distinction matters. Projects can proceed even in high-hazard areas if the analysis is honest about risks and the mitigation actually reduces exposure. What cannot proceed is development where hazards are minimized through assumptions rather than addressed through design. The litigation reveals the difference between authorization and certainty. The 2008 agreement authorized Centennial. The signatory environmental groups cannot challenge it, but authorization from 5 organizations is not immunity from all legal challenge. CEQA creates procedural requirements that apply regardless of private agreements. Courts enforce those requirements. The county must produce environmental reviews that survive judicial scrutiny. The company must wait while that process unfolds. Shareholders must accept that authorized does not mean imminent. Centennial represents approximately 1/3 of the company's residential development portfolio by unit count. The project is positioned as a solution to regional housing shortages. The affordability component represents approximately 18% of total units. Company materials emphasize the project's compliance with state housing goals. The framing presents development as response to crisis rather than speculative construction in a hazard zone. Whether the housing is needed does not resolve whether this specific location is appropriate for that housing. The people who would live in Centennial do not yet exist as stakeholders in the litigation. They have not purchased homes, they have not enrolled children in schools that have not been built. They have not tested whether evacuation routes function under fire conditions. They have not attempted to secure insurance in a market increasingly unwilling to cover properties in high-risk areas. They will inherit whatever the courts, the county, and the company decide. Their exposure begins the day they close escrow. Their ability to influence the outcome ended before they knew the project existed. If Centennial faces years of additional litigation and revision, what does that mean for Mountain Village and Grapevine? The 3 projects were authorized together. They share infrastructure dependencies. They rely on similar assumptions about water availability, fire management, and market absorption. Challenges to one project raise questions about all of them. Chapter 10. Grapevine and Mountain Village. Marketing materials show mountain ridgelines at sunset. Hiking trails thread through oak woodlands. Resort amenities are positioned against protected landscape. The images suggest escape from density, proximity to nature, and homes where wildlife remains visible from windows. The branding emphasizes what makes the location desirable. It does not emphasize what makes the location constrained. Grapevine occupies 8,010 acres immediately adjacent to the Tejon Ranch Commerce Center. The project envisions 12,000 homes at full build-out, 5,100,000 square feet of commercial space, more than 3,367 acres of parks and open space within the project footprint. The proximity to TRCC is both an advantage and a complication. Existing infrastructure reduces development costs. Existing logistics operations create noise, traffic, and air quality impacts that future residents will experience daily. Grapevine North represents an additional 7,655 acres identified as future opportunity. The company has not pursued entitlements. The land remains in agricultural or open space use. The acreage exists as optionality. When market conditions justify it, when infrastructure capacity supports it, when regulatory climate permits it, Grapevine North could be activated. Until then, it appears on maps as potential rather than plan. Mountain Village occupies 26,417 acres in the Tehachapi Mountains. 5,082 acres have received approvals for 3,450 homes. 160,000 square feet of commercial space, 750 hotel keys, more than 21,335 acres designated as open space within the project boundary. The project is framed as nature-adjacent development, a place where conservation surrounds homes rather than homes encroaching on conservation. The distinction is semantic. Development and conservation do not coexist without edge effects. Roads fragment habitat. Lighting alters wildlife behavior. Domestic animals introduce predation pressure. Human presence changes movement patterns for species that avoid contact. The open space within project boundaries functions differently than open space without development nearby. Calling it conservation does not make it equivalent to landscapes where humans do not live. Mountain Village depends on the same infrastructure corridors as Centennial and Grapevine. State Route 138 provides primary access. Water must be delivered or extracted from basins already facing sustainability requirements. Fire protection requires staffing and equipment that do not currently exist at the scale needed to serve thousands of additional homes. Schools, hospitals, emergency services, all must be built or expanded. The projects are separate on maps, but connected through shared constraints. Cumulative impact analysis attempts to account for what happens when multiple developments proceed simultaneously or sequentially. Traffic from Centennial adds to traffic from Grapevine, adds to traffic from Mountain Village. Water demand compounds. Fire risk increases with each additional structure. Evacuation capacity becomes more constrained. The projects individually may meet regulatory thresholds. Together they create conditions none were designed to handle. The environmental reviews for each project analyze cumulative impacts. The analysis depends on assumptions about timing, about infrastructure investments, about market absorption rates. If timing accelerates beyond assumptions, infrastructure lags. If absorption slows, financing mechanisms that depend on steady revenue fail. If one project succeeds while others stall, the infrastructure sized for multiple projects becomes oversized for actual demand. The assumptions must hold simultaneously across decades. History suggests they will not. Emergency egress becomes critical when multiple projects occupy the same corridor. State Route 138 serves as primary evacuation route for all three developments. During a major wildfire event, 19,000 homes from Centennial attempt evacuation simultaneously with 12,000 homes from Grapevine and 3,000 homes from Mountain Village. 34,000 residential units funneling onto a two-lane road that merges with Interstate 5 at a single interchange. The traffic modeling and environmental reviews treats each project separately. Real evacuations do not occur in isolation. Service demand creates fiscal pressures on county governments that approved the projects. Los Angeles County and Kern County gain property tax revenue from development. They also assume obligations for road maintenance, sheriff patrols, library services, park maintenance. The counties negotiate agreements with developers about cost sharing. The agreements assume steady growth and absorption. When growth slows or stops, the revenue assumptions fail while the service obligations remain. Taxpayers absorb the difference. The portfolio logic makes sense from the company's perspective. Multiple projects diversify risk. If one faces regulatory delays, others can proceed. If one market softens, another may strengthen. If one project encounters environmental constraints, approved alternatives exist. The strategy protects shareholder value by ensuring the company always has entitled projects ready for development when conditions permit. From a regional perspective, the portfolio creates different dynamics. 3 large projects in close proximity concentrate impacts in a narrow corridor. The developments compete for the same water allocations, the same labor force, the same home buyers. They stress the same roads and emergency services. They expose similar populations to similar hazards. Diversification for the company becomes concentration for the region. Mountain Village branding emphasizes the conservation context. The project literature describes development surrounded by protected lands. The protected lands exist because of the 2008 agreement. The agreement authorized Mountain Village as part of the conservation bargain. The development makes the conservation politically and financially viable. The conservation makes the development marketable. Each justifies the other in a logic loop that has no external verification. What stops growth first? Water might. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act requires basins to reach equilibrium between withdrawals and recharge. If groundwater proves insufficient, surface water allocations from the State Water Project provide alternatives. Those allocations fluctuate with hydrology. Dry years reduce deliveries. Consecutive dry years strain reserves. Climate change makes historical patterns poor predictors of future availability. Fire might stop growth. Insurance markets already restrict coverage in high-hazard areas. If insurers withdraw entirely, mortgages become unavailable. If mortgages become unavailable, sales stop. If sales stop, construction stops. The constraint emerges not from regulation, but from risk assessment by entities with no stake in whether development proceeds. Courts might stop growth through litigation that delays projects beyond financial viability. Markets might stop growth if absorption rates cannot support the scale envisioned. Infrastructure costs might stop growth if financing mechanisms fail. Any single constraint can halt development. Multiple constraints operating simultaneously make success unlikely, regardless of what regulatory approvals exist. Who pays for the infrastructure that enables 34,000 new homes in a mountain corridor? Who pays for the fire stations and water systems and schools? The answer involves community facilities districts, special taxes, development fees, and county bonds. The mechanisms distribute costs across time and across different populations. Future residents pay special taxes. Current taxpayers pay if bonds default. Developers pay upfront fees, but recover them in home prices. The complexity obscures who ultimately bears which costs. The projects exist as approved entitlements, pending re-entitlements, and future opportunities. They exist as lines on maps and numbers in securities filings. They exist as marketing materials showing sunsets over ridgelines. They do not yet exist as places where people live and children attend school and evacuation routes get tested under fire conditions. The gap between entitlement and reality is where assumptions either hold or fail. Water will determine which assumptions survive and which do not. Chapter 11. Water. A dry creek bed cuts through the valley floor. The channel shows evidence of flow, rounded stones, eroded banks. Debris lodged in branches where high water deposited it before receding. The creek runs only during winter storms and spring snowmelt. The rest of the year it remains empty. Farther east, a well casing rises from hard ground, surrounded by pumping infrastructure, storage tanks, electrical connections, access roads showing recent use. Everything depends on what moves through pipes, rather than what moves through streams. Water makes development possible in landscapes where rainfall alone cannot support concentrated populations. The Tejon Ranch receives precipitation that varies dramatically by elevation and exposure. Higher areas receive more. Valley floors receive less. None receives enough to sustain 19,000 homes without importing water from elsewhere or extracting groundwater from basins that recharge slowly. The 2008 Conservation Agreement authorized development. It did not create the water to support it. The company's water strategy involves multiple components assembled over decades. Groundwater rights in several basins. Membership in water districts that deliver imported supplies. Contracts for state water project allocations that extend through 2085. Banked water stored underground during wet years for use during dry years. Water attached to agricultural operations that can be transferred to development. The portfolio creates resilience through diversification. It also creates exposure through complexity. Securities and Exchange Commission filings document water costs with precision that reflects their significance to financial projections. 9 months ended September 30th, 2025. The company paid $12,366,000 under water contracts. Future payment obligations for water totaled $1,458,839,000 as of that date. The contracts involve multiple counterparties and multiple delivery mechanisms. State water project contracts disclosed in filings run through 2085 with allocations dependent on hydrology. The company reported deploying $8,926,000 in capital to acquire water assets during the first 9 months of 2025. Example, purchase costs appeared in disclosures at $986 per acre-foot in 2025 with escalators built into long-term agreements. The numbers document scale that exceeds infrastructure costs or land acquisition. Water represents the single largest ongoing obligation the company faces. The billion-dollar liability assumes deliveries occur as contracted. It assumes districts fulfill obligations. It assumes state water project allocations remain viable under climate conditions that differ from historical norms used to design the system. Every assumption contains risk. Sustainable Groundwater Management Act imposes requirements that constrain how basins can be used. Basins must reach sustainability within 20 years of the law's effective date. Sustainability means withdrawals do not exceed recharge over time. Basins where withdrawals currently exceed recharge must reduce pumping or increase recharge until equilibrium is achieved. The law applies to basins underlying portions of Tejon Ranch. The company operates within those basins. Future development would increase demand from those basins. SGMA creates a ceiling that market demand cannot overcome. The company's disclosed strategy involves portfolio resilience. Water from multiple sources reduces dependence on any single basin or any single contract. If one basin faces curtailment under SGMA, other basins provide alternatives. If state water project allocations decline during drought, banked groundwater provides buffer. If imported water becomes unavailable, groundwater extraction increases within sustainable limits. The strategy works if all components remain accessible and if the limits do not tighten simultaneously. Climate linkage connects water scarcity to wildfire risk. Drought conditions increase vegetation stress. Stressed vegetation becomes fuel. Fuel loads increase fire intensity. Fire intensity reduces firefighting effectiveness. Reduced effectiveness increases structure loss. Structure loss increases insurance costs. Insurance costs reduce housing affordability. Affordability decline reduces market demand. Demand decline reduces project viability. Water shortage becomes a development constraint through chains of causation that environmental reviews struggle to model. Infrastructure dependency amplifies risk. Wells require power. Power transmission crosses fault zones and fire corridors. Transmission failures during disasters eliminate well capacity when demand peaks. Water storage requires maintained facilities. Deferred maintenance creates vulnerability that compounds during crisis. Redundancy costs money. Cost pressures encourage single-path solutions. Single-path solutions fail catastrophically rather than gracefully. The question is, why continue entitling residential projects when water constraints signal limits that contradict growth assumptions? The answer involves financial structure and incentive alignment. Entitled land is worth more than unentitled land. Approved projects can be sold to home builders or developed directly. The value exists whether or not construction occurs. Shareholders benefit from entitlements that increase asset values regardless of whether those assets convert to built projects within specific timeframes. Entitlements also create options. If water becomes less constrained, if SGMA implementation proves less restrictive than anticipated, if state water project allocations stabilize, if new banking arrangements emerge, the company holds approved projects ready to activate. Abandoning entitlement efforts would eliminate those options. Maintaining entitlements preserves flexibility, even if current conditions make development difficult. The downside risk transfers to future residents and to counties that approved the projects. Residents who purchase homes do so based on disclosures in purchase documents and marketing materials. Those disclosures mention water sources and legal constraints. The disclosures are accurate as far as they go. They do not predict whether contracts will deliver as expected or whether sustainability requirements will tighten. Buyers assume risk they may not fully understand. Counties that approved projects based on water supply assessments face fiscal exposure if water proves insufficient and development slows after infrastructure bonds are issued. The creek bed remains dry except during storms. The wells continue pumping. The contracts extend decades into the future. The obligations compound annually. The constraints tighten incrementally. Water permits what can be built. Water limits what will be built. The distance between those two conditions is where financial projections confront physical reality. How these projects get financed reveals who benefits when assumptions hold and who pays when assumptions fail. The mechanisms involve bonds, special taxes, and decades-long repayment structures that convert land into city through accounting as much as construction. Chapter 12. Bonds and Liens. The bond documents run to hundreds of pages: legal descriptions, interest schedules, repayment terms, special tax formulas, lien priorities. The paperwork translates dirt into debt and debt into roads. Community facilities districts make this possible. A CFD is a financing mechanism that lets developers build infrastructure before residents arrive to pay for it. The property owners within the district vote to authorize bonds. The bonds fund construction. The infrastructure gets built. Future residents pay special taxes for decades to retire the debt. Their property carries liens ensuring payment. If they do not pay, the county can foreclose. The mechanism is common across California. It solves a timing problem. Cities need roads and pipes before homes generate property tax revenue. Developers cannot fund billions in infrastructure from equity. Counties cannot afford to build infrastructure speculatively. CFDS bridge the gap. Bonds provide capital now. Special taxes provide revenue later. The structure works if homes sell steadily, if buyers accept the tax burden, if infrastructure actually serves the promised development, if nothing disrupts the absorption schedule for 25 years. Tejon Ranch Commerce Center operates under 2 CFDS, with specific obligations documented in Securities and Exchange Commission filings. TRCC West issued bonds totaling $19.5 million secured by liens on 420 acres. TRCC East issued bonds totaling $96 million secured by liens on 1,931 acres. Additional authorized bond authority of $18.6 million provides capacity for future infrastructure. The company expects to pay approximately $3.6 million in special taxes during fiscal year 2025. These are not optional payments. They are secured obligations that attach to land regardless of whether development proceeds as planned. Los Angeles County and Kern County approved these financing structures after reviewing projections about development timing, revenue generation, and service costs. The counties gain infrastructure without upfront capital expenditure. They also assume long-term service obligations. Roads require maintenance. Water systems require operations staff. Fire protection requires stations and personnel. The projections assume steady growth funds, steady revenue that covers steady costs. Real growth is never steady. Markets pause. Litigation delays. Natural disasters disrupt. When revenue assumptions fail, counties face gaps between obligations and resources. Political incentives favor approval. County supervisors represent districts where development promises jobs and economic activity. Opponents can delay, but rarely stop projects that comply with regulations. The environmental reviews address CFD financing as separate from land use impacts. The bond documents treat land use outcomes as separate from financing mechanisms. Each approval process fragments the whole into pieces small enough to authorize individually. Growth. Paying for itself is the official story. The alternative story involves risk transfer. Developers gain access to bond proceeds without personal liability for repayment. Future residents assume tax obligations they may not fully understand when they purchase homes. If the development succeeds commercially, everyone benefits according to pro forma projections. If it fails, bondholders lose principal, residents face underwater tax liens, counties scramble to provide services without projected revenue, and the land remains encumbered for decades. The scale at Tejon amplifies every risk. Tens of thousands of homes across multiple projects create infrastructure demands that dwarf typical suburban development. Water systems must deliver across distances that require major capital investment. Fire protection requires stations positioned strategically across hundreds of square miles. Roads must handle peak evacuation loads, not just daily commutes. The infrastructure cannot be built incrementally. It must be built to ultimate capacity based on projections that assume everything proceeds as planned. Ecological sensitivity adds constraints. Construction cannot fragment conserved corridors. Infrastructure must route around protected habitats. Easements limit where pipes and power lines can run. The conservation agreement creates spatial constraints that increase costs and reduce redundancy. Engineering solutions that might work elsewhere become infeasible when 90% of the landscape is off-limits. Seismic risk introduces failure modes that typical suburban CFDs never face. The San Andreas Fault runs directly beneath portions of the ranch. A major earthquake will damage infrastructure regardless of engineering standards. Roads will be impassable, water lines will rupture, power transmission will fail, repair costs will exceed reserve funds. Special taxes cannot pay for reconstruction if properties become uninhabitable. The bonds assume infrastructure lasts long enough to be paid off. Catastrophic failure breaks that assumption. Wildfire. Risk operates on a different timeline but produces similar exposure. A major fire that destroys structures and displaces populations eliminates special tax revenue for years. Insurance payouts may not cover reconstruction. Owners may abandon properties rather than rebuild in proven hazard zones. The liens remain attached to land that has lost most of its value. Bondholders hold debt secured by ash. If CFDs are common financing tools used throughout California, what makes Tejon uniquely sensitive? The answer involves scale combined with constraints. Most CFDs finance suburban expansion where infrastructure serves a few thousand homes. Tejon envisions tens of thousands of homes on land where conservation agreements, ecological sensitivity, seismic hazards, and wildfire risk create failure modes that ordinary suburban development never encounters. The financial engineering is standard. The landscape is not. Who ultimately decides whether these risks are acceptable? County supervisors approve the CFDs. Bondholders purchase the debt. Future residents agree to the taxes. But none of those decisions occur in rooms where land use outcomes, conservation commitments, and shareholder expectations converge. That decision-making happens elsewhere, in boardrooms where different calculations apply. Chapter 13. Proxy Fight. The proxy materials arrived in mailboxes in spring 2025. Glossy booklets outlined director candidates. Letters from management urged shareholders to vote for the existing board. Counter-letters from activist investors argued the company was underperforming and undervalued. The land itself was absent from these materials except as inventory on balance sheets. 270,000 acres represented potential value waiting to be unlocked. The activists made their case with numbers, asset values, development timelines, cost structures, management compensation. Their argument was simple. The company controlled an irreplaceable asset and was not maximizing shareholder returns. Entitled land sat undeveloped while competitors moved faster. Conservation commitments limited optionality but also provided political cover for patient capital. The strategy made sense when the board believed long-term value exceeded short-term returns. The activists believed the market was undervaluing the company precisely because development was moving too slowly. Institutional investors faced a choice. Vanguard held significant shares and published its reasoning. The stewardship analysis acknowledged the company's unique position. The conservation framework represented a strategic advantage. Responsible development over decades made more sense than rushed construction in a volatile market. But governance matters. Board composition matters. New perspectives can improve performance without abandoning long-term strategy. Vanguard voted for change, measured change that maintained conservation commitments while increasing accountability. But 2025 brought the shareholder vote. The activist candidate won election to the board. A longtime director was removed. The outcome represented a shift in control significant enough to alter strategic priorities without constituting a complete takeover. The company remained committed to the 2008 agreement legally and contractually, but pressure to demonstrate value intensified. Boards answerable to shareholders who demand results operate differently than boards insulated from such pressure. The proxy fight cost $3.4 million, according to company disclosures, covering legal fees, proxy solicitation services, and communications campaigns. That sum exceeded the Conservancy's annual operating budget. It represented months of special tax revenue from the CFDs. It was money spent not on infrastructure, conservation, or development, but on a contest over who controlled decisions about what happened to the land. Operational changes followed quickly. Cost reduction initiatives, staff evaluations, strategic reviews. These phrases appeared in company communications without specifying what they meant in practice. Staff reductions occurred through attrition and selective non-renewal of contracts. Programs deemed non-essential faced budget scrutiny. The definition of essential became a function of shareholder return rather than conservation outcomes or public benefit. To environmental groups that signed the 2008 agreement, the proxy fight represented a third axis they had not anticipated. They had negotiated with the company expecting continuity in management philosophy. They had accepted development in specific zones based on assurances about responsible build-out timelines. The agreement bound the company legally. It did not bind shareholders who could replace directors and demand different priorities. The conservation commitments were permanent. The appetite for patient capital was not. To the activists and their supporters, the proxy fight represented accountability. Public companies have fiduciary duties to shareholders. Land held for decades without generating returns raises legitimate questions. The conservation agreements were facts to navigate rather than obstacles to challenge. Development in approved zones could proceed faster and more profitably without violating any commitment. The question was whether management had sufficient urgency. When value becomes the mandate, certain costs disappear from calculation. Mitigation beyond legal requirements becomes discretionary. Access programs beyond contractual minimums become expendable. Conservation management beyond baseline monitoring becomes subject to budget pressure. The Conservancy operates on funding commitments that could be re-evaluated under financial stress. Nothing in the legal documents guarantees generosity. Everything assumes good faith. Where do ordinary lives appear in boardroom logic? They appear as market demand. Future residents represent revenue potential measured through absorption models and price points. Workers at logistics facilities appear as labor costs. Commuters on State Route 138 appear as traffic impact calculations. Community members living near proposed developments appear as stakeholders to be managed through public relations rather than partners in decision-making. The proxy materials contained thousands of words about value creation and governance. They contained no words about wildfire evacuation or water sustainability or cultural landscape protection. The proxy fight reveals something fundamental about private land ownership at scale. The decisions that shape landscape outcomes occur in boardrooms where shareholders assess return on investment. Those decisions are constrained by law and contract, but within those constraints, priorities shift based on who controls the board and what they believe the market demands. A company committed to patient stewardship can become a company committed to accelerated monetization without breaking a single legal obligation. The activists prevailed. The board composition changed. The strategic pressure intensified. The land remained private. The conservation agreements remained binding. The development rights remained authorized. Everything and nothing changed simultaneously. The fence line looked identical from the outside. Behind it, calculations were being revised. What gets cut first when shareholders demand results? Chapter 14. The Cost Ledger. State Route 138 runs 2 lanes through most of the corridor. The evacuation models in environmental reviews treat each project as if it will burn alone. Fire does not respect administrative boundaries. When multiple developments ignite simultaneously, the arithmetic compounds in ways no single project review captures. The gap between modeled evacuation and actual evacuation is measured in lives. Evacuation modeling makes assumptions about warning time, about compliance rates, about vehicle spacing, about merge efficiency. The models produce numbers suggesting adequate capacity under controlled conditions. Real evacuations rarely produce controlled conditions. Wind shifts. Multiple ignitions occur simultaneously. Panic eliminates orderly departure. Vehicles break down blocking lanes. Accidents compound delays. Parents return for children at schools. Elderly residents move slowly. Animals require transport. The gap between modeled evacuation and actual evacuation is measured in lives. Insurance companies calculate risk using data not available to environmental reviewers or traffic engineers. They know which areas experienced fires. They know structure loss rates. They know claim patterns. Some companies are withdrawing from high-hazard areas entirely. Others are raising premiums to levels that make homes unaffordable regardless of purchase price. Banks require insurance for mortgages. Without insurance, sales stop. Without sales, construction stops. The constraint emerges not from regulation, but from actuarial assessment conducted by entities with no stake in whether development proceeds. Diesel exposure concentrates along the Interstate 5 corridor where TRCC operates. Warehouses generate truck trips. Truck trips generate particulate emissions. Particulate matter accumulates in air that residents breathe, that workers breathe, that children breathe at schools yet to be built. The health impacts are documented and gradual. Increased asthma rates, cardiovascular stress, cancer risk elevation. These outcomes appear in epidemiological studies, but rarely in environmental impact reports as site-specific harms. The calculations treat regional air quality as a basin-wide phenomenon. The exposure concentrates locally. Workers in logistics facilities face different exposures. Warehouse operations involve repetitive motion injuries. Shift work disrupts circadian rhythms. Temperature extremes during loading operations create heat stress. The labor force required to operate 20 million square feet of distribution space numbers in the thousands. These workers live somewhere. They commute somehow. They breathe the same air. Their children attend the same schools. They are essential to making the development function, but largely absent from discussions about who benefits. Collision risk increases with traffic volume and truck percentage. Interstate 5 through Tejon Pass already experiences accident rates elevated by grade, curves, and weather. Adding tens of thousands of daily vehicle trips from new development increases exposure for everyone using the corridor. The trucks are heavier, the consequences are more severe. The regional burden increases while the benefits concentrate with the landowner. Access to conserved lands remains controlled. The Explorer membership program continues operating under terms the Conservancy defines. Fees limit participation. Schedules limit flexibility. Routes limit exposure to landscape features the company prefers visitors not see. The conservation agreement requires public access. It does not define how much or how often or under what conditions. The minimum contractual requirement becomes the maximum practical reality when budgets tighten and priorities shift. Cultural sites documented by tribal consultation remain largely inaccessible to tribal community members who lack the resources or inclination to navigate membership programs and scheduled events. Sensitive locations cannot be disclosed without compromising their protection. But protection through exclusion is not the same as protection through stewardship. The landscape holds meaning that cannot be preserved through fences and limited entry programs. The loss is real even if it cannot be quantified in environmental impact reports. Equity analysis requires identifying who benefits and who bears cost. The company and its shareholders benefit through land value appreciation and development profit. Future residents benefit through housing availability if they can afford purchase and if infrastructure performs as promised. Counties benefit through property tax revenue if growth proceeds as modeled. Workers benefit through employment if wages and conditions make the jobs worth accepting. Risk bearers include future residents exposed to wildfire and seismic hazards they may not fully comprehend. Workers exposed to air quality impacts and accident risk. Existing community members facing traffic, noise, and service competition. Taxpayers covering shortfalls when revenue projections fail. Tribal communities losing access to cultural landscapes. Species populations stressed by cumulative edge effects and habitat fragmentation. The distribution is uneven. The benefits concentrate. The risks distribute. The conservation commitment protects 240,000 acres. The development footprint occupies roughly 30,000 acres across 3 projects, 90% conserved, 10% developed. If conservation covers such a large majority, why does the remaining 10% matter enough to sustain years of litigation and controversy? The answer involves scale and irreversibility. 30,000 acres of development in this specific location creates impacts that extend beyond property boundaries: wildfire exposure, water demand, infrastructure requirements, and emergency services. The cumulative effect of what gets built in the 10% shapes outcomes for the 90% conserved and for the region beyond. What does success mean here? To the company, success means entitled projects reaching construction and generating returns that validate decades of patient landholding. To environmental groups that signed the agreement, success means conservation protections holding across time while development remains confined to designated zones. To local communities, success might mean jobs and services without overwhelming impacts. To future residents, success means homes they can afford in locations that remain livable. To tribal communities, success requires meaningful consultation and cultural protection. To species dependent on landscape connectivity, success means functional habitat persisting despite development. These versions of success conflict. They cannot all be achieved simultaneously. The trade-offs were built into the 2008 agreement. The consequences emerge as the development proceeds from entitlement to construction. What remains contested is not whether the agreement exists, but whether the outcomes it produces are acceptable, whether protection of 90% justifies risk in the remaining 10%, whether private control can serve public benefit, and whether the costs that never appear on balance sheets matter more than the revenue that does. The gate remains locked. The ridge glows amber at sunset. The land functions as it has for millennia. What changes is not the landscape, but the claims laid upon it. The calculations run in boardrooms. The risks distribute across populations who never participated in negotiations. The fence line marks the boundary between what is conserved and what can be developed. It does not mark the boundary between who benefits and who pays. Chapter 15. The Gate Again. The gate looks identical to how it appeared at dawn months ago. Chain link and steel, 8 feet tall, warning signs bolted to the crossbar. Private property. No trespassing. The lock has not changed. The fence line has not moved. Interstate 5 produces the same constant roar 2 miles west. Oak Savanna rolls eastward toward the same ridgeline. A raptor circles overhead, riding thermals that have existed for millennia. The physical reality remains unchanged. The meaning has been rewritten entirely. What this gate protects and what it excludes depends on which story you believe about what happened here. The land was occupied by multiple native nations before Spanish and Mexican land grants created property claims Europeans would recognize. The fort and reservation brought federal power that framed control as protection. Corporate consolidation turned scattered holdings into a single private landscape larger than many cities. The 2008 agreement locked in conservation for 90% while authorizing development for the remainder. Logistics operations at TRCC transformed portions into distribution infrastructure. Residential projects promised to add tens of thousands of homes. A proxy fight shifted governance priorities toward accelerated value extraction. Each transition rewrote what the gate means. Three futures remain possible. The distance between them is narrower than it appears, but wide enough to produce dramatically different outcomes. Scenario A proceeds from conservation first principles. Build-out occurs slowly. Development concentrates in the smallest viable footprints. Infrastructure costs remain modest because expectations remain modest. The Conservancy receives adequate funding to expand access programs and deepen monitoring. Transparency increases. Annual reports document conservation metrics alongside development progress. Shareholders accept patient capital. Counties fund services without assuming unsustainable obligations. The projects that proceed do so because they meet heightened standards for safety, sustainability, and public benefit. This path requires discipline that market pressure rarely permits. Scenario B proceeds from market acceleration. Development moves as fast as entitlements and financing allow. The three major projects proceed simultaneously. Infrastructure gets built to ultimate capacity based on optimistic absorption projections. Special taxes rise to cover bond obligations. Insurance markets tighten but do not collapse entirely. Fire seasons intensify, but major disasters narrowly avoid the developments. Water constraints bind, but creative accounting maintains the illusion of adequacy. The conservation lands remain protected legally while receiving reduced management attention. Access contracts. Public benefit becomes whatever minimal compliance requires. This path generates maximum near-term returns while deferring long-term costs onto populations not yet present. Scenario C proceeds from constraint recognition. Courts require additional environmental review that delays Centennial for years. Water sustainability requirements force redesign of Mountain Village. Insurance unavailability makes Grapevine unfinanceable, as currently planned. The company responds by scaling down rather than abandoning. Smaller phases, different models, mixed-use communities requiring less infrastructure. The conservation lands remain protected, but fewer resources flow to management. The portfolio becomes more modest. Shareholders demand explanations. Some directors lose seats. The company survives, but the grand vision contracts. This path produces neither conservation victory nor development disaster. It produces compromise, measured by what constraints will not permit. Which path emerges depends on factors largely beyond public control. Courts will rule based on law and evidence. Markets will respond to risk and opportunity. Climate will produce conditions that defy prediction. Shareholders will demand returns that boards cannot ignore. Counties will make decisions based on fiscal pressure and political calculation. The Conservancy will manage with whatever resources the company provides. Future residents will purchase homes based on information that may prove inadequate. Workers will accept jobs that expose them to hazards they cannot fully assess. The ethical questions remain unresolved because they are genuinely unresolvable within existing frameworks. Was the 2008 agreement legitimate? 5 environmental organizations with legal standing and political influence negotiated a bargain that bound them not to challenge developments in designated zones. Other organizations and individuals retained the right to litigate. The agreement created certainty for the signatories. It created no certainty for anyone else. Whether that bargain serves public interest depends on whether you believe the conservation protection justifies accepting development risk. Both sides present evidence. Neither side proves their case definitively. Who decides the future of this landscape? Legally, the corporation decides within constraints established by regulation, contract, and court precedent. Shareholders influence corporate decisions through governance mechanisms, including proxy contests. Counties approve or deny projects based on environmental review adequacy and political calculation. Courts enforce procedural requirements and substantive standards. Environmental groups can litigate if they did not sign agreements promising not to. The public participates through comment periods and elections. Tribal governments assert sovereignty over trust lands and cultural resources. The decision-making is distributed across multiple actors with different authorities and different incentives. No single entity controls outcomes. No coordination mechanism aligns incentives toward any particular vision. What is owed to the land itself, to the cultural landscapes it contains, to the species that depend on it, to the people who will live near it or pass through it or never see it, but whose lives are shaped by decisions made about it? These questions lack legal answers. They operate in the realm where law ends and ethics begin. Conservation protects habitat, but not in the form it would exist without development pressure. Access provides entry, but not the kind of relationship to place that comes from unmediated presence. Development provides housing, but not necessarily in locations where people should live. The bargain produces measurable outcomes. Whether those outcomes constitute what is owed remains contested. The binary questions from the beginning return with accumulated weight. Protected refuge or monetized land bank. Both are simultaneously true. 240,000 acres under conservation easements represents protection at a scale rarely achieved through private agreements. The protection exists because it created authorization for development that increases land value. The refuge and the monetization are the same transaction viewed from different positions, public good or private instrument. The conservation serves ecological goals that benefit species, water quality, air quality, climate resilience. The conservation serves corporate goals that enable development, increase asset values, and generate returns. The instrument produces the good. The good enables the instrument. Whether one purpose subordinates the other or whether they coexist in genuine balance depends on perspective shaped by proximity to benefits and exposure to costs. California faces these questions repeatedly across landscapes where conservation and development negotiate for space. Tejon Ranch operates at a scale that makes the tensions visible. Most places fragment the questions into pieces small enough to approve individually. Here, the pieces remain connected. The conservation commitment is explicit. The development rights are explicit. The trade-offs are documented. The outcomes will be measurable. What happens here tests whether private land ownership at landscape scale can serve public interest or whether private interests inevitably subordinate public benefit to shareholder return. The gate remains locked. The ridgeline glows amber. The land continues functioning as habitat and watershed and corridor. The overlay of human claims intensifies without changing the physical substrate. Oaks grow, condors soar, water flows seasonally. The earthquake will come eventually. Fire will come regularly. What humans build will face tests that models cannot fully predict. Whether the buildings will be occupied when those tests arrive depends on decisions occurring now, in rooms where the land appears primarily as numbers on balance sheets. The fence marks a boundary between what is conserved and what can be developed. It marks a boundary between public access and private control. It does not mark a boundary between success and failure because both outcomes remain possible and perhaps inevitable simultaneously. The conservation is real. The development rights are real. The risks are real. The benefits are real. The costs are real. Which of these realities matters most depends on who you are and what you believe land ownership means when the landscape in question is irreplaceable and the decisions are irrevocable.